let's try out the brushes that we have as part of our class pack. And so you're gonna have a series of these golden Taklon brushes. They're good all-purpose brushes. They're best for watercolor and acrylic and tempera. They're not so good for oil. And then I also gave you a nice Sumier brush. This is really good for ink and watercolor. So I'd like you to use all of these. If you have other brushes at home that you want to also test out, there's a video on brushes. Brushes that flick back kind of loosely and aren't too stiff are usually good for watercolor. These are okay. Here I can kind of show this one's a little bit softer, right? This is really good for watercolor. Tends to hold a lot of water. So if you want to do more, feel free, but I'd like you to test out each of your brushes. For my Painting 1 class, you have tons of space underneath the palette that you're painting, okay? So we're gonna test out the brushes there. If you're in Painting 2, you're gonna have to grab yourself a new sheet of paper to complete this exercise. And so what I'd like you to do is to label. If you wanna, draw it out, you can do it too, or you could even trace your brushes. Like maybe you do this ferrule, the metal part, and then the bristle part. Maybe you wanna trace that and leave a space so that you can have all of them kind of cascading down the length of your page, right? Or you could just label them. So I'm gonna go ahead and label. All right, and the first brush I'm gonna try is my Sumier brush. You can use whatever color you like. I'm going to make a suggestion. When I'm painting at home, I like to keep my bristles and my brushes close by, and I find it's really easy to organize it either in a brush storage system, right? Brush storage system, or I like to just put them so that they're upright in a jar, and I normally keep that by my water. So you could try that at home too. So let's go ahead and try. Get yourself some water, right, and paper towel like we did before, and go ahead and, scrub some color, right? Scrub some color. And then test out the brushes. I'd like you to figure out what the brushes are good for. So for the Sumier brush, maybe what you want to do is fill it with color and then run it across the page nice and even to see if it will hold lots of water. And you can see it does a great job. Once you've done that, I'd like you to try something else. So if you need to pause and do that, go ahead and do that, and then we'll continue with the next step. Okay, so I'd also like you to try, one of the things you can do with most of your brushes is you can start by pressing hard and then easing up on the pressure so that the point gets thinner and thinner and thinner, right? So you can see that this round brush, this Sumier brush, is really good for organic details, right? Because it's not crisp and it's not straight, and this holds a lot of water, right? So maybe you definitely want to label it with the name of the brush and then write yourself some notes, right? What is that brush good for, right? That will help you in the future to select your brushes. I use these for a lot of practice. I use these for large areas since they create big open areas, right? So then let's go ahead and try our other brushes. We have a big wash brush. This is a flat brush. So the next one is a wash. And this one says that it is a 3/4 of an inch brush. So label the size for yourself as well. And then go ahead and test it out. I'm gonna try it with a slightly different color. So I'm gonna go ahead and scrub, scrub, scrub. Right? And so I'm gonna have you test out the color. So I'm going to use it on the flat end and pull it across. Right? And you can see it doesn't hold nearly as much paint as the bristles of the Sumier brush. But what it does do is create nice crisp edges. So these flat brushes, where the ferrule is flat, this metal is flat, and the bristles are flat, are really good if you have to paint in a straight area, right? So you can practice this. Another thing you can do is go across this way and get a really thin line, right? And then, I'm gonna get all fancy with you here. You can go from thick to thin. So what you do is you go horizontal and then twist the brush, right? And you can have it go from fat to skinny, right? That's all three of those lines are with the same brush. So this is good for large areas and crisp edges. So I use a wash brush. I think the name kind of says it all. I use it for washes of color, big areas of color. Okay, so then you have another smaller flat brush. This is, they say it's a shader. This is really a flat brush, right? The bristles are longer than it is wide. Often if a brush is squared, we call it a bright. So another name for this wash brush is sometimes called a bright. And so this one, you can label it shader, since that's what it says, right? But I want you to keep a note that this is also a flat brush. This is a number 6. Now a number 6 in one brand and another number 6 in another brand can be a completely different size. So it's sadly not very uniform. Go ahead and test it out. Try another color or the same color, I don't really care, right? And see what it's good for, right? You can see where the color starts to use up all the color. I bet we can do the same thing here where we can use the side of it to create a thin line, right? And then you can go from thick to thin. But you can see it just does not hold as much water as some of the other brushes. 1, because it has fewer bristles, and 2, because it's smaller, and 3, because it's a Taklon, right? They just don't hold as much water as natural hair bristles, okay? So because this is smaller, this is good for small, crisp details, right? You could also say this would be good for thick to thin, right? You have another one of these shaders, super, super small, right? So this is a number 2. Right? So go ahead and try this one out. I did the flat side first, right? You can see it doesn't hold a lot of water. And you can go from thick to thin too if you want to. Right? Kind of test it out. So you can see that big brushes are good for general details, general shapes. And then as they get smaller, they tend to be good for details, right? So in your set, you also have a brush that's called an angle or an angler, right? And so that works pretty much like this as well, as like a flat or a shader brush. So this is a 1/4 of an inch, I should say. All right. So what these are good for is going from thick to thin. And they have nice crisp edges. So I'm going to take it here on the wide end, right? So I'm going to hold my brush like this, right? And I'm going to twist it to go thin. So you can do this as many times as you need to figure out what they're good for. Always clean out your brushes really well and then reshape them, right? So you want this angler brush to stay nice and flat, right? You want these to stay nice and flat. So when they're clean, you can reshape them with your fingers too. Or you can brush them on the paper towel so that they hold their shape. They're very similar to your hair. If you go to bed with wet head, right? And then you sleep crazy, you're gonna ruin your bristles, okay? The next brush we have is our round, and this is our number 4, so we're gonna start with the largest one, all right? So round brushes are a little less crisp, and so these are really good for organic details. Right? So what I mean by organic is they could be good for trees or leaves. Right? You can do the thick to thin on these as well. Right? So if I press really hard, they'll get thicker. And then if I ease up on the pressure and use the tip of it, I can go really thin. The more you practice, the more you find that you can do a lot with a large brush. I almost paint exclusively with large brushes. I very rarely use little ones. All right, so let's go to our round 2 and test this one out. All right, you can see nice skinny line, goes thin, right? When you press hard, right, it tends to run out of paint and kind of create this rough sort of texture, which could be good if you are painting something that is rough. Oh, you guys couldn't see that, darn. I apologize. Let's try that again. Right? So if I press hard, it runs out of paint. Now you can use that as texture if you need to, right? A dry brush, you just want to make sure that you're being kind to it. But you can go from thick to thin, right? The last brush that you have is a liner brush. So this has really long, skinny brushes or bristles, right? So your liner brush, this is a number, it's like a 00. That's what that basically means. And so you can use this, right? This is really good for like branches on trees and eyelashes and little wispy details. And so if you press hard, you can go from thin to thick, or thick to thin, I should say, right? But you can see how this does hold a pretty good amount of paint because the bristles are longer. And you can get really thin details. So I'd like you to try to paint the whole length across. And then of course, if you want to try out some other little details with your brushes, you can as well.